Welcome to the deep dive. We know you love to really get under the hood of things, like when you're trying to grasp a new field or you've got that game night coming up and you just need to know how it all works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you sent us a really interesting set of materials this time. The core rules for Stack and Spiral, this very whimsical adaptation called 100 Acre Group Therapy, and then something completely different, the much darker setting of Lowhollow.
Yeah, quite the range.
It is, yeah. So we're going to take a deep dive into the Stack and Spiral, which is a personality-driven RPG role-playing game engine that really centers on this concept of narrative collapse.
That's right. So essentially, you're interested in understanding the foundational ideas behind Stack and Spiral and how it takes a unique approach to both character and story. We're going to be looking at the core mechanics of this engine and then how those mechanics are kind of shifted and adapted for these really different applications that you've given us, from therapeutic Winnie-the-Pooh to the really sort of subdued melancholy of Lowhollow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm very fascinated to see how that plays out. So I guess the first thing for me is, if someone's coming to this system for the first time, how do characters even function in this world? What are the core, the real nuts and bolts of a Stack and Spiral character?
Well, the foundation of character creation in Stack and Spiral, at least according to the core rulebook that you sent, is the function stack.
Okay.
So each character has 5 internal functions. These are reason, impulse, recall, wonder, and connection.
Okay, 5. Got it.
Now, the crucial thing to grasp here is that these functions, they aren't just like labels for personality traits, right?
Right.
They represent a character's fundamental internal wiring. It's how they process the world around them, their default mode of thinking and reacting.
Okay, so internal wiring, not just like surface level.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And each of these functions, these 5 functions, is assigned a specific modifier. So you have dominant, which gets a +3 modifier, auxiliary, which is +2, tertiary +1, neutral 0, and then inferior, which is a -2 modifier. And here's a key element. Each of these modifiers can only be used once per character.
Okay.
So you can think of it as like distributing their mental and emotional strengths and weaknesses in a very particular way. It makes each character unique in how they approach things.
Yeah, so this stack, right off the bat, you can tell a lot about a character.
Exactly.
What are they good at? What are they probably going to struggle with? Just their natural biases.
Exactly. If you're trying to, quickly get a sense of who a character is in this system, their function stack is the key. It immediately highlights their inherent strengths, their likely weaknesses, and sort of the unconscious filters through which they're going to experience and react to the story, right? Someone with reason as dominant is going to approach problems very differently than someone whose dominant function is impulse.
Right, absolutely. It's baked into the system, so this internal wiring, that's set.
Yes.
But when a character's actually trying to do something in the game, like how does this function stack come into play, like mechanically?
That's where the roles mechanic comes in.
Okay.
And it's fairly straightforward. You roll a standard 20-sided die, a d20, add the modifier of the function that's most relevant to what the character's trying to achieve,
Okay.
and then you compare the total to a predetermined difficulty level for whatever that action or task is.
Okay, so it's simple, right? Just a single roll, add your modifier.
Exactly. Makes it easy to keep the game flowing.
What are those difficulty levels that we're talking about?
Well, the core rules, they outline 3 basic thresholds for you. Easy tasks have a difficulty of 10, medium tasks are 15, and then hard tasks are 18.
So if you're picturing this, someone with that dominant +3 in, say, recall, they're going to have a much better chance of remembering a key detail
Absolutely.
in a hard situation than someone whose recall is their inferior at -2.
Exactly. And this really drives home that those strengths and weaknesses we discussed, they aren't just there for flavor. They have a direct and tangible impact on what a character is likely to be good at or struggle with in the game. It's like the system is baking these probabilities in based on their internal makeup.
Yeah, it makes it so like the character sheet actually matters.
Absolutely.
That's how characters are built, how they try to do things. Let's get into the real meat of this system, what makes it unique, which is this narrative collapse idea.
Right.
Where does that begin in the mechanics?
Narrative collapse is really anchored in this idea of the flaw trigger.
Okay.
So every character in Stack and Spiral, they have this specific flaw, and very often this flaw is connected to their weakest function, right? That inferior one, or it could be linked to some other element of their personality that's kind of ripe for dramatic exploration. Think of it as a built-in pressure point.
Like a vulnerability just waiting to be poked.
Precisely. And the flaw trigger, that's the specific circumstance or situation that causes this flaw to surface. And when this flaw disrupts the story in a meaningful way, or, and this is crucial, it exposes the character's inner turmoil, they earn what's called a spiral point.
Ooh, okay. So that's the engine of the unraveling you mentioned.
That's exactly it, the spiral point, the beginning of the spiral.
Give us some examples of these flaw triggers in action so we can really picture it.
Sure. So the core rulebook actually gives some really great examples. Imagine a character whose inferior function is connection, right? Their flaw trigger could be something like, when asked for emotional support, they deflect with cynicism.
Oh, I know that character type.
Right. Another one, let's say their inferior function is reason. Maybe their flaw trigger is, when facing a logical puzzle, they jump to conclusions without considering the evidence.
Okay.
Other examples, when confronted with authority, they become aggressively defiant. Or maybe when offered intimacy, they create distance. You see how this works?
Yeah, and it's so smart because it immediately creates drama from the character themselves. It's not like they're failing at a task. It's their own internal stuff.
Their weakness, their flaw.
Yeah, that's driving the story, which is just so cool. And I'm guessing that's the aha moment for you, like seeing how these flaws are meant to bake in that inherent conflict.
Absolutely.
And those really character-driven complications that we love in stories.
It's baked right into the mechanics. These flaw triggers, they turn the characters into active participants in the narrative's unraveling, right? It's driven by their internal landscape rather than just external events. And this, of course, leads directly to the significance of the spiral point.
So tell me about these spiral points. What do they even represent, and why would a character want to earn them? Because they're tied to this whole idea of things falling apart.
Right. So spiral points, they represent a kind of emotional momentum, right?
Yeah.
But it's momentum fueled by the character's internal friction rather than just traditional successes, right? It's the narrative power that comes from embracing imperfection, from those moments of vulnerability.
Imperfection is power. That's a really interesting take on the usual RPG reward systems. How do you get these points, these glorious failures, so to speak?
You earn them in a few different ways, all tied to this idea of leaning into your flaws.
Right.
So one, obviously, is by indulging your flaw, especially when it's most inconvenient, most detrimental to the group or the situation.
At the worst possible time.
Exactly. Another way is by failing, but failing beautifully, right? Like a spectacular blunder that maybe doesn't achieve the intended goal, but really escalates the tension or contributes to the sense of things falling apart.
Okay.
And then finally, taking emotional risks. So like a sudden confession, an act of vulnerability, maybe a betrayal, even like an unexpected moment of tenderness or kindness when it doesn't make sense. All of these can earn you a spiral point.
You're rewarded for screwing up or playing into your weaknesses.
Oh, essentially, yeah.
And creating those big dramatic moments.
Right.
But these points must have a purpose, right? You mentioned they can be spent.
Absolutely. You don't just hoard them. Spiral points can be spent to influence the unfolding story in several really interesting ways. So one is you can spend a spiral point to re-roll a check, giving you another chance at something, even when everything's going sideways.
Okay, a little bit of control on the chaos.
Exactly. Or with another player's consent or some kind of clever narrative justification, you can spend a point to trigger another character's flaw.
Ooh, interesting.
Right. Imagine the drama there.
I could get very messy very quickly.
It could. You can also spend a spiral point to activate a special move, which is a unique ability that's tied to your character's specific function stack, maybe playing into their inherent strengths or even their weaknesses.
Okay.
And then maybe most importantly, in terms of this whole narrative collapse concept, you can spend a point to trigger a narrative shift. So this could be a flashback scene that reveals some crucial backstory,
Okay.
maybe a sudden emotional reveal, hidden truth or lie that comes out. Or even, and this is interesting, you can secretly introduce a new element or complication into the story that only you as the player are aware of.
Wow, that's interesting.
Right.
So you're really manipulating things.
You're playing with fire a little bit. And actually, speaking of playing with fire, the rules mention that if a flashback or a reveal, anything triggered by spending a spiral point is especially impactful, either mechanically, like it really changes the situation, or emotionally, like deeply buried truths come out, then it might cause what's called the spiral track to tick upwards.
Okay, so the spiral points, they let you create drama and manipulate the narrative.
Exactly.
But at the risk of accelerating this whole spiral we're tracking. Tell me about this spiral track. What is it exactly?
The spiral track is essentially a table-level meter of how badly things are unraveling.
Okay.
It's a 10-step tracker that's monitored either by the game master or through a shared agreement among all the players. Think of it as like a visual representation of the group's descent into chaos or emotional disarray.
So what makes it go up? What makes the spiral intensify for everybody?
It advances in a few ways. The first is if the group as a whole faces a significant challenge and they fail collectively.
Makes sense.
Another way is when individual characters experience those personal spirals, right? By indulging their flaws, getting those spiral points,
Okay.
or even when there's a noticeable breakdown in the emotional cohesion of the group, like a moment of deep mistrust or a failure to really connect when it's most needed. All these things tick that spiral track up.
And when it hits that 10th step, the big 10, that's the full narrative collapse.
That's it. The spiral completes.
What happens then?
Well, the core rules offer a few really evocative examples of what that might look like. A character might have a complete emotional breakdown, or a character might decide to leave the group entirely.
Okay.
Someone might metaphorically burn bridges, maybe destroy a vital objective, or the very nature of the game world around them could undergo a really significant and irreversible shift. Importantly, the rules specify that at this point, the current session usually concludes, or it transforms into something drastically new.
So it's a pretty big endpoint.
A major turning point.
Or at least a turning point.
Yeah,
It's not just about individual character arcs. It's like a shared arc of unraveling.
precisely. It creates a sense of collective consequence arising from both the individual struggles and the group's overall dynamic. Now, where it gets really interesting is to see how these core concepts are adapted and reinterpreted in different tones and settings. And the materials you've shared give us two fantastic examples of this.
Yeah, let's get into those applications.
Okay.
First up, 100-Acre Group Therapy. And I mean, the title alone is just very suggestive of a very specific tone, a very humorous way of looking at this.
Exactly. 100-Acre Group Therapy takes those beloved characters from Winnie-the-Pooh and reimagines them as individuals grappling with, as it calls it, mismatched function stacks and emotional baggage. The tone is described as either melodramatic reunion or absurdist grief.
So instead of having their nice little adventures in the 100-Acre Wood,
Right.
it's like a support group.
Yeah, exactly.
Pooh and friends working through their issues.
That's the delightfully strange premise here. And the core mechanics, they're all cleverly reskinned to fit the specific tone. So instead of spiral points, they earn oh bother points
Okay.
when they lean into those characteristic flaws. And you can spend them in very similar ways. Rerolling checks, triggering others' flaws, using special moves, and very appropriately for Pooh Bear, introducing moments of what they call vape logic.
Vape logic. That is a brilliant way to put it, to bring in that sort of circular, nonsensical way that Pooh thinks.
It's brilliant.
What about the collapse, then, in the 100-Acre Wood?
That's tracked by what the game calls the Doom track, which is wonderfully described as Eeyore's existential timer.
Of course.
Just like the spiral track in the core rules, it ticks upward with collective failures, with individual authors.
Okay.
And when it hits 10, the session culminates in either a collective sulk, quiet resignation, or, and this is great, some oddly moving group hug.
Perfect. That's so in character.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that this Doom track can be reset by doing something impossible.
Yes.
What does that even look like in the 100-Acre Wood?
So the game provides a list of 6 wonderfully improbable actions,
Okay.
and players can choose one or roll randomly to determine which one they're going to try to achieve. Examples include, and this is almost shocking, let rabbits plan a work and thank him for it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would never happen.
Or, this one's kind of poignant, tell Piglet you remember the thing that they didn't do.
Oh.
Or the ultimate act of emotional defiance, hug Eeyore without explaining why. Right. And if you can pull off one of these impossible actions, you can actually reset the Doom track, often at some comical or even emotional cost.
That's fantastic. They really get these characters and the absurdity of it all.
Absolutely.
So what other unique elements does 100-Acre Group Therapy add to the basic framework?
Well, it introduces something called wood conditions, which adds this kind of like layer of environmental mood to the game. They're determined by rolling a 6-sided die at the start of the session, and they include things like the fog of disassociation, which gives you disadvantage on checks unless you narrate a memory out loud, or the hilarious sticky honey mood, where everything just feels overwhelming and players get an extra Oh, bother point per hour due to the sheer stickiness of everything.
It's like the setting itself is participating in this whole unraveling.
Absolutely.
So can we see a few examples of like the characters, their function stacks, and how their flaw triggers play out in this setting?
Sure, so let's take Pooh, for example.
Hmm.
His dominant function is connection, +3, which really emphasizes that deep empathy, that desire to connect with everyone. But his inferior function is reason, at -2, which perfectly explains his often illogical, kind of roundabout way of thinking. And his flaw trigger. When structure is needed, Pooh eats the plan or misplaces a crucial clue.
Oh my God, that is so perfect.
It fits so well. Then you've got Tigger with his dominant impulse, +3, and his inferior recall at -2, his flaw trigger. When memory or focus is needed, Tigger derails the group by breaking something or bouncing off mid-task.
Of course he does.
They nail these characters.
They do, yeah. What about Piglet and Eeyore?
So Piglet, reimagined as the anxious archivist, has dominant recall, +3, but his inferior is impulse at -2.
Makes sense.
Perfectly reflecting his tendency to overthink and hesitate. His flaw trigger. When action is required, Piglet panics, hides, or delays the group.
Classic Piglet.
Right. And then Eeyore, of course, the bleak analyst, dominant reason, +3, inferior impulse at -2, his flaw trigger, predictably. When positivity or movement is needed, Eeyore predicts doom, slowing momentum. Rabbit, the overplanner, with dominant reason, +3, inferior impulse, -2, naturally spirals when the plan is broken. It's like they understand these characters on a fundamental level.
It really does feel like that.
Yeah.
So how does all this come together in actual gameplay? Like, what would a session of 100-acre group therapy look like?
100-acre group therapy provides some scenarios to illustrate this. One scenario is called the vape juice heist, where Pooh's precious honey-flavored vape juice mysteriously disappears.
Oh, no.
And the wood condition in play for this particular session is sticky honeyroot.
Of course it is.
The scenario details how various characters have their flaws triggered as they sort of bumble their way through trying to figure out this mystery, leading to, bother points being earned and the doom track steadily increasing. Pooh even gets to use his special move, the Vape Cloud of Confusion, to try and re-roll a particularly challenging group check with predictably hazy results.
A vape-induced noir mystery in the 100-acre wood.
That's what it is.
I never thought I would hear those words in that order.
Right. Another scenario, this one is called The Curse of the Empty Honeypot, where Pooh is convinced his beloved honeypot is under some kind of mystical curse because it's inexplicably empty.
Oh, no.
The wood condition for this session is the gloaming, which makes everyone feel kind of uneasy and a bit off kilter.
That's spooky.
And again, the scenario lays out how each character's flaw trigger and their often very misguided attempts to help or inadvertently hinder the situation just escalate things, causing that doom track to rise as the, surprisingly mundane but emotionally significant for Pooh, truth behind the empty pot is slowly revealed.
I love that they took something so simple and made it so dramatic for Pooh.
Exactly. It's the little things.
So 100-acre group therapy, it sounds like it really uses the stack and spiral framework to make a game that's not only genuinely funny, but also surprisingly insightful about these characters and their anxieties and quirks.
It really does.
Now, we have to completely shift gears.
Yes.
Talk about Lowhollow, which seems to occupy a very different emotional space.
Oh, very much so. Lowhollow is presented as a game with a tone of either existential horror or absurdist grief.
Wow.
Yeah, it's all about creating this really specific atmosphere. Soft, melancholic, and yet somehow it's described as oddly kind. It's like a forgotten place, populated by these creatures whose memories are unreliable, and it really adds to that overall sense of unease and disorientation.
Soft and sad.
Yeah.
That's a huge change of pace from Winnie-the-Pooh.
Yeah.
How do the core mechanics adapt to this totally different atmosphere?
Well, the 5 core functions, first of all, are renamed to beautifully capture the mood of the setting. Reason becomes stillness, representing that quiet contemplation.
Okay.
Impulse becomes yearning, which is all about longing and unfulfilled desire.
Okay.
Recall becomes obfuscation, which is about saying much while revealing little. Wonder evolves into murk, representing vague feelings, dreams, a kind of fogginess.
I love that.
Right. And connection, perhaps most appropriately, remains connection.
Right, because even in this sad place...
You need that connection.
Yeah. So what about the points you earn for triggering flaws?
Right, so instead of spiral points or, oh, bother points, in Lowhollow, you earn what are called quiet psi points.
Much more subdued.
Yes, much more subdued. And the overall collapse, the table level collapse, that's tracked by something called the loneliness track.
Oh.
And when this track reaches its maximum of 10, the game describes Lowhollow as stopping making sense, where dreams turn sour and the session concludes in, and this echoes the 100-acre wood, but it feels very different here, an oddly moving group hug.
Wow. So structurally similar, but just tonally completely different.
Absolutely. It's a hug born out of despair rather than whimsy.
Yeah, yeah. And what about those impossible actions, those things that could offer a glimmer of hope and maybe reset the loneliness track?
These are also really, really well tailored to the tone of the setting. They're much less about humorous absurdity and more about genuine moments of emotional exposure. So
Yeah.
examples include apologize in front of Hush, which is this creature that represents, silence and avoidance.
Okay.
Or maybe burn something you swore you'd keep, that letting go of a cherished possession, say what you meant without metaphor, being direct and honest.
Right.
Or even, and this is beautiful, share a silence that hurts to hold.
Oh, wow.
It's about that shared vulnerability.
Yeah. So beautiful, but so sad.
Oh. It's Lowhollow. It fits the setting perfectly.
Does Lowhollow also have those environmental factors like the wood conditions?
It does.
Okay.
They're called valley conditions, and they really add to the mood. So you might have the unseasonable season, where it snows in the middle of summer, which causes dread unless a character actively engages with wonder. Or maybe Drift's lament echoes, where every sound seems to reverberate with this weight of past disappointments.
So even the environment's like actively making things sadder?
Yes, exactly. It's very pervasive.
So let's talk about the inhabitants of Lowhollow. What are they like?
Sure. So we have Nimbus, the yearning soul, whose inferior function is murk, that flaw trigger. When clarity is needed, Nimbus waxes poetic and loses the thread of the conversation.
Okay, so they're avoiding the tough stuff.
Exactly. Then there's Drift, the vagabond philosopher with inferior wonder. They emotionally vanish when closeness is needed.
Ah, the classic runner.
Exactly. Hush, the cold reminder with inferior impulse, tends to show up uninvited when warmth is needed. Thistle, the gentle anchor with inferior murk, tends to smooth over reality when truth is required.
Another avoider.
Right. Mothwish, the late dreamer with inferior recall, often drifts into imagined futures when the present requires attention.
Okay.
And Patch, the unraveling optimist with inferior murk, hides behind this facade of cheer when honesty is needed.
So many ways to avoid a real connection, and that's so much of what Lowhollow seems to be about.
It's a tapestry of these characters who are all kind of struggling with different forms of emotional disconnection, and that plays out in the scenarios as well.
So what do these Lowhollow scenarios look like?
One scenario is called the shell that whispers. Nimbus finds a conch shell that eerily repeats unspoken thoughts.
Spooky.
Right. And the valley condition in play makes speaking directly really difficult, like interpreting these misremembered truths is the challenge. And the scenario emphasizes Thistle's tendency to offer comfort through avoidance. Soup and denial, they call it.
Makes sense.
And the unsettling presence of Hush as these key moments that contribute to that overall sense of quiet despair and earn those quiet psi points.
So strange and unsettling. Very appropriate for Lowhollow. What's another example?
Another scenario is the candle that was never lit, which revolves around the silent ritual intended to bring some kind of solace to the community.
Okay.
And the valley condition for this scenario makes voices sound really distorted off if players fail a stillness roll.
Oh, wow.
And in this context, Nimbus's tendency to bring that whispering shell, that thing that repeats thoughts, to this moment of intended quiet. And another denizen named Ember tries to disrupt the ritual by replacing the unlit candle with dynamite.
Whoa.
You see these contrasting ways they're trying to cope with their grief and loneliness.
So we've got silent rituals, dynamite.
Exactly.
It's all very Lowhollow. What's one more example?
Last one. The sleep that refused to end. This one focuses on Drift, who's fallen into a deep and prolonged sleep, which causes all sorts of strange occurrences for the other denizens. And the valley condition in this scenario makes everyone feel like they're moving and speaking underwater with this noticeable delay in their interactions.
Oh, wow.
It explores the community's reaction to Drift's absence and the ways that their own flaws come out in this very unusual, isolating situation.
It sounds like both 100-Acre Group Therapy and Lowhollow,
Yeah.
while being so different,
Right.
really effectively use the core stack and spiral mechanics to create totally different gaming experiences.
They really do. It's a testament to how adaptable the system is. You can use the same basic concepts of function stacks, flaw triggers, this idea of tension escalating, and create games that are both mechanically interesting and very emotionally resonant, whether it's through humor or a more poignant exploration of our inner struggles.
Just as you've been listening, I think it's pretty clear that Stack and Spiral is more than just a game. It's a framework for exploring
Yeah.
all these complexities of how we work, the tension within us, how we mess up, how we interact, how we kind of fall apart together.
That's a great way to put it. You now have a good understanding of how function stacks define a character's psychology and their biases, how those flaw triggers are those points of narrative friction driven by their weaknesses, and how spiral points or, bother points, quiet side points, they all represent a kind of emotional momentum that leads to a larger unraveling, a collapse at the table.
And these contrasting examples of Hundred Acre Wood and Lowhollow, they really show you how versatile this system can be.
Absolutely. It really makes you think about how these mechanics, this interplay of strengths and weaknesses, these kind of predictable points of failure, the way emotional consequences build up, all of that, how it could be applied to analyze characters, not just in games, but in other media or even in real life groups.
That's an interesting thought for you to take away.
Right.
Could understanding your own, metaphorical function stack, your own strengths, your own weaknesses, your own personal flaw triggers, could that help you understand your own patterns of behavior, your own potential for, shall we say, narrative collapse in your own life? It's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. Reflecting on our own internal wiring and those specific situations where we tend to derail, that could offer a really unique, maybe even illuminating perspective on our own personal stories and how we interact with the world.
Well, this has been a fascinating exploration of Stack and Spiral. I think you have a really solid understanding now of how it works. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. It's a really rich system with a lot of nuance, and I hope you enjoyed this deep dive as much as we did.